Okay, now we're covering the first half of chapter 23, which is the physiology of breathing. Your learning objectives for this PowerPoint are one, to contrast the three different types of specialized breathing structures and describe how they function. I want you to define unidirectional versus tidal versus non-directional ventilation, also explain what diffusion lungs are and bimodal breathing, and then provide an example of an animal that does each. And finally, I want you to differentiate between co-current, countercurrent, and cross-current gas exchange. Breathing in animals always starts with external respiration. Basically, what external respiration is, it's the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide to and from the gas exchange membrane. And so when you're thinking of the gas exchange membrane, what you need to be thinking of is the membrane that divides the outside environment, which could be air or water, with the internal tissues. So in humans, this is the alveoli in our lungs, but it can be different depending on if you're a fish. If you're a fish, you're going to have gills, right? And then the medium isn't going to be air, it's going to be water. So diffusion across the gas exchange membrane occurs because partial pressure is higher outside the membrane than inside the membrane. And the idea here is what we learned in the previous chapter. Gases always move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So if you're breathing in oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen outside in the air is going to be higher than inside, right? Or if you're breathing out CO2, what actually happens is the CO2 is higher inside, and therefore it's going to move across the membrane by diffusion. Breathing can occur by ventilation, or it can actually occur by diffusion. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. Okay, there's three types of specialized structures that animals have for breathing. Lungs, which we can picture, are invaginated into the environment, into the body, and they contain basically the environmental medium inside the body. So think of a human or any mammal, right? You have lungs inside your body, and the air goes into your body. External gills are evaginated, which means they go out from the body and they project directly into the environment. So they're going to be bathed with water. You also have internal gills, and they're going to be evaginated from the body and project into some type of superficial body cavity, and then the medium gets pumped through that body cavity and bathes those internal gills. This would be a little easier to do in class because I would have you define each of the terms: unidirectional ventilation, tidal ventilation, non-directional ventilation, diffusion lungs, and dual or bimodal breather, and then provide an example of an animal that does each, right? So I'm going to have you fill in the table on your handout with each of these terms, explain them, and provide an example. Let's start with tidal gas exchange. So tidal gas exchange is how our lungs work. What happens is you breathe in and air flows in because your diaphragm moves down, and that expands the lungs and causes the partial pressure in the lungs to decrease and allows oxygen and air to just flow in because the partial pressure decrease. And again, the idea here is that oxygen always moves from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. And then you relax your lungs, the lungs get smaller, and the air is exhaled. So tidal breathing just means that you have an inhale and an exhale in the same area, right? So the numbers we hear are partial or arbitrary pressures. They're not the true value, but the idea is that your oxygen goes from an area of 100 partial pressure, 100 millimeters of mercury, to like 60 millimeters of mercury, and then you breathe it back out, right? They're just arbitrarily assigned. And then once the oxygen gets in there, because there's less oxygen in your blood than in the air inside the lungs, it's also going to diffuse because, again, oxygen always moves from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So that was tidal breathing when we talk about what the lungs do and things like that. And that's kind of what we're used to. But unidirectional ventilation is going to be a little different. And there's 3 different relationships that you're going to see with blood flow that occur in unidirectional ventilation. Either it's co-current, meaning the medium, like the air or the water, flow in the same direction that the blood flows. So that would be co-current. Countercurrent would mean the medium or the air or water flows in one direction and the blood flows in the opposite direction. Countercurrent. Finally, you can have cross current. What that means is that the medium flows one direction and then the blood flows at a right angle or right across it, right? And so you're going to see a different look for that one. Okay, we're going to look at the example of teleost or bony fish, right? The brachial breathing system in these fish happens through these gill slits, right? And what do you notice? You notice that the water flows in one direction. But if you zoom into the figure here, you should notice that the right here, right, the blood flows in the opposite direction. So what type of breathing would that be? Okay, how do the bony fish actually keep the water moving across their gills? Because what if they're standing still? If they're, or swimming still, not in moving, how is it that they can keep the water flowing across the gills? What they actually have is this buccal pressure pump and an opercular suction pump. And it works in succession. Basically what happens is they open their mouth and it kind of looks like these 2 pistons, right? And so the idea is they open their mouth and it causes water to go from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure because they basically act like a piston moving up. And then it suctions in by another piston moving down, and then they both move up. So I don't know if this makes sense, but as you're looking at it, you see the 2 different pistons moving. And because of that movement, up, down, you see that it's pulled in to the mouth and then pushed into the opercular cavity and then out through the gills, right? And that constant movement of the mouth is what you see. Have you ever seen a fish? They are like a goldfish. They're going to constantly be moving their mouths. What they're doing there is they're breathing. They're moving the water into the mouth across their gills, and then that bathes their gills with the water, and then the oxygen is going to flow from the water into their gills.